Good afternoon, everyone. We're a bit late. Apologies for that. There was a class that lasted longer than we expected. So it is my great pleasure today to present to you Professor Douglas Atkinson from the University of Brussels. He's teaching critical thinking and literature and has many other titles that you can go and check it out on the webpage we created for the event if you want to know more. So I present to you Professor Douglas Atkinson. That's what he has to say.
Okay, hello everyone. This is going to, like the basic idea first of how this is going to proceed today. Because my plan is actually to make this a little more interactive than you might actually be used to. So the basic idea will be that I'll give you a little bit of background first so you know what's going on. Then I'm actually going to read a paper to you guys in terms of give you some real academic content and real concrete interpretation of some basic ideas in Japanese literature and Japanese philosophy. And then we're going to talk about it, hopefully we'll ask some questions afterwards, you guys can clarify some things. This is not the kind of thing I expect you guys to immediately know what I'm talking about. Yeah? So the idea is that anything I mention that you don't know what I'm talking about, perfectly fine, just write it down, take some notes. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have afterwards about anything you want. But I'm originally American, although I'm at the University of Brussels now. I'm originally American, and I'm familiar with these programs in terms of international programs in different universities. And a lot of times, even when you're studying abroad, you don't actually get a good dose of the material of where you're studying. So I wanted to give you guys a good little introduction to some Japanese philosophy, or some contemporary Japanese philosophy, and some important Japanese literature for people to think about, in case you guys have or haven't read any. So just like by show of hands, has anyone read any Japanese philosophy? Almost. Yeah, you thought about it? Okay, yeah, cool, good. Has anyone read any Japanese literature, like 20th century Japanese literature? Yeah? Who have you read? Names of authors like Murakami or?
Murakami, Yukio Mishima.
Mishima, okay, you're on the right track, okay, cool. Has anyone ever, if I say things like Japanese modernism, you know what those two words mean individually, but you know what I mean together? Yeah, roughly, kind of, not at all. Perfectly fine if the answer is not at all. I'll be happy to fill you guys in. We need to get the ball rolling. So these are some fun ideas we need to talk about. And especially, I'd like to stimulate your awareness of the fact that you guys are in Tokyo. And you have a huge possibility in terms of reaching out and learning more about these things from the Japanese themselves, from Shōwa University, your sister university here. There's a lot of opportunity here that you guys might not be aware of just because there's too much going on in the university at any one time. So today I'll be talking mostly about two main figures, a Japanese philosopher named Kojin Karatani, or Karatani Kojin, who is alive. Amazing, most philosophers should be dead, but he's actually alive and still very active, even though he's in his early 80s. I just had dinner with him the other night, actually. Very, very influential philosopher, kind of a little more notorious and infamous in Japan, but extremely popular in the West. And then a certain novelist named Abe Kobo, who maybe not as influential as Murakami or Mishima, but is up there with them, and actually was very good friends with Mishima and very admired by Murakami. So I'll be talking about something, basically I'm just talking about, the idea is going to be, we're talking about Karatani Kojin and the subject of / in literature. And what I mean by this basically is that we're talking about Karatani Kojin, who's got several very, very important books. His real big first book is one that I still value the most. This is called Origin of Modern Japanese Literature. And it sounds quite straightforward, but it's actually anything but. And so he's interested in, basically the idea of modern Japanese literature and where it comes from. And so we're talking about the subject of literature. It sounds like we're talking about the topic of literature. But when I mean the subject in literature, I mean the self, or the person, or the concept of the individual, and what happens to our sense of identity once we're discussing literature. So literature, on one hand, can be telling a bunch of stories that are just entertaining and fun, but literature from a philosophical point of view has a dramatic change in the sense of self we're talking about, and the idea of language and the idea of identity that's actually operative in these concepts. Yeah? So like I said, if at any point I say anything that sounds too crazy for you, just write it down. I'll be happy to answer any concrete questions you guys have afterwards. Make sense? Okay. So without further ado, So my intention today is to begin a series of reevaluations, focusing primarily on a rereading of two key notions and their relationship to Japanese modernism. Specifically, inversion, or the concept of inversion in Karatani Kojin, and the idea of what's called sustained flight in Abe Kobo. My goal is to show not simply their similarity between these two authors and these two ideas, but more importantly, the consequences that these notions have for identifying and understanding our relationship with the discourse of Japanese modernism, and the unique influence this has for formulating our understanding of the philosophical notion of the individual subject, both in and of modern literature. Now, I contend that these consequences and the challenges that they pose are uniquely synthesized in Kobo Abe's novel, The Boxman. Has anyone heard of the novel called The Boxman? Okay, something to look forward to, trust me. Yeah? So time permitting, I will conclude today's lecture by suggesting how this work responds to and reposes certain key questions about the remains of modernity and the literary subject which still haunt us today, especially in contemporary Japanese literature, most notably in the work of Muraki Murakami. So, most relevant for my reading is the relationship between the temporality, the experience of time, of writing, and the temporality of the modern construction of the self, or identity. And this is the point of departure for Karatani's many inversions, which is a very technical term in his work, which I'll get to in a second. Now, Karatani's famous, if not infamous, work called Origins of Modern Japanese Literature begins with a very perplexing claim, namely that all of the terms in the title should be bracketed or suspended. What does that mean? It means origins, well, you think you know what you mean, now you don't. Modern, you think you know what it means, now you don't. Japanese, you definitely don't know what this means. Literature, you certainly do not know what this means. So all these words make sense to us in a formal registry, but for Karatani, all of these words belong in brackets or in quotes. He wants to say, these words are much more dangerous than we think, and they're much more constructed than we think. They're not just simple terms, you know? So essentially in this text, through a reading of several key notions, most importantly the idea of inversion, but thinking along the themes of interiority, the landscape, illness, and the child, Karatani wants to suggest that there's no such thing as an origin of modern Japanese literature, which sounds kind of strange. Perhaps even more perplexing, he even wants to argue that technically there is no such thing as modern Japanese literature. Instead, what we think of when we think of modern Japanese literature is in fact the result of an inversion in thinking and an inversion in discourse. And that the terms origin and modern literature are actually cultural borrowings or impositions inherited from European modernism. Now for me personally, it would only be a guess, but I think that it must have been Frederick Jameson's, he's a famous literary theory in the United States at Duke University. He has an offhand remark in the introduction to The Origin of Modern Japanese Literature about the, quote, science fictional character of Karatani's theoretical prestidigitations, which are performed through the key notion of inversion, which in Japanese is tento, that first made me realize that there may be more at stake, or even better, more at play, in Karatani's thinking than I had first thought. Now, immediately after looking up the word prestidigitation, which by the way means conjuring or sleight of hand or magic trick, I stepped back and asked myself, what magic trick is Jameson talking about? The book that I had just read to me seemed a very solid, albeit complex, reading of Soseki in the development of modern Japanese literature. Has anyone heard the name Soseki? Yep. Yeah. Okay. If you're Japanese, imagine. So yeah. So this is the kind of thing that if you go to high school in Japan, you probably are forced to read Soseki. It's the kind of thing that everyone reads. It's like Huckleberry Finn in the United States or something like this. So he's the major figure of the turn of the century Japanese literature, major figure in terms of associated with modern Japanese literature. If you're looking for a point of departure, he's became very famous through a book called I Am a Cat, which is actually very, very funny. If you happen to be a cat lover, it's very funny in particular, but it's a very playful text. He's got many other books in very broad degree of complexity, but if you want a fun place to start, definitely start with I Am a Cat. You know? And you know, the origin of modern literature seems like a straightforward reading of Soseki and where he belongs in Japanese modern literature. And then you realize, well, what's the magic trick that Jameson's talking about? And it's only after thinking about this that I realized that I had only seen half of the show that's on display in Karatani's work on Japanese literature. And I had missed precisely the prestidigitation that Jameson was applauding. To put it bluntly, what does Karatani mean by inversion? I mean, I know the word in English, but what's he actually mean by this term? Well, what does inversion have to do with Japanese modernism and the subject of literature at work therein? Now, those of you that may have read the text, you know, maybe there are those of you, who've never heard of it before. That'd be totally understandable at the undergraduate level. Some of you may have heard of it before, and maybe you actually did see the quick wave of Karatani's magic wand in the first reading. But I openly confess that it took me some time, and definitely more than one reading, to finally notice the inversion at work in the very notion of inversion. Now, I would argue that in order to understand Karatani's importance for Japanese modernism, we must first and foremost clarify this all-important yet elusive notion, or method, or strategy, or critique, or whatever it is that inversion ends up being in the end. But briefly, I would suggest that there are two primary and equiprimordial significations of the term. First off, there is undoubtedly the hermeneutic or discursive technique that is used to identify, as Karatani does, diachronic disruptions in a conceptual genealogy. Bunch of crazy words. Diachronic disruptions. Diachronic is a word for basically the linear notion of history, that history proceeds in a meaningful, progressive manner. And so a diachronic disruption is when time, instead of seemingly moving forward, starts to loop back on itself. And a conceptual genealogy is different from history in terms of tracing the origins of things. We're going back, looking at the ideas of a history as opposed to the actual dates of a history. Looking at the history of concepts as they form as opposed to just figures and facts. You know? So with Karatani, just as soon as you think that the chicken must have come first, for example, Karatani will glide in and demonstrate the primordiality of the egg. But therein lies the rub. For it is necessarily the case that for Karatani to be able to apply the hermeneutic or interpretive strategy of inversion, a diachronic disruption or inversion must already have taken place. Otherwise, there would be nothing to identify in the first place. So the inversion must also be, or must refer to, the event in question as well. So it's not just the technique, it's also the event. It's also what happens in history, diachronically speaking. So it is the interruption itself, and thus a form of praxis and movement. So along with the technique of identification, inversion is the event itself, and thus necessarily brings with the question of temporality and the person or the subject that experiences this, especially in regard to literature, which I'd like to suggest is different than we normally experience ourselves. So, in the everyday world, language is a tool that I use to express myself. It means what I want it to mean. I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. In literature, we have an excess of meaning, and making up for or understanding that excess is a little more philosophically complicated. So the sense of self that's involved in literature is going to be a little more complex, and also a little less stable than our normal psychological sense of the self. This is most pertinent when we consider the Genbonichi or the Shosetsu movement. The Shosetsu movement in Japanese literature refers to the notion of what's called the I novel, like I, not like I, by the I like in the first person singular. So the I novel as it's commonly referred to. So the I novel, this happens in the first third, first fifth of the 20th century, maybe a little bit prior to this, depending on the scholarship that you're quoting. It's generally characterized by a confessional style, which is adapted from European modernism. That is, the author attempts to reveal or confess their inner voice, their inner self. So, returning back to the prestidigitation that Jameson was trying to call my attention to, inversion is a term in Karatani that can fall into the camp of either praxis or activity or theory in terms of thinking about what we're actually doing. It is quintessentially both, and therefore neither at the same time. It has to be one or the other. But if it's potentially both, we can't decide which one it is. It's like Schrödinger's cat. It's alive and dead at the same time. And it's precisely this fluidity, this alchemically transformative nature, which necessarily links, I would like to argue today, inversion to the nature of literature itself, especially as it is described by Abe Kobo. It is worth noting here also that in Japanese, two key cognates of the Japanese term tento, which is, again, is the Japanese word for inversion, two cognates that come with this are bewilderment and losing one's head. So if we start getting confused here, we're on the right track and in the right company. But literature is also undeniably a central concern for Karatani as well. He also works on Marxism, he also works on economics, works on Kant, works on more classical philosophy. But originally, he was the foremost literary critic in Japan in the 70s and 80s. He was the major literary theorist in Japan. Now, he argues specifically, that, quote, the Genbonichi, or the I movement, the I novel movement, was first and foremost a new ideology of writing. Now, accordingly, I've attempted to reverse the assumption that it was the needs of the inner self that gave rise to the Genbonichi movement, and Karatani wants to propose instead that it was the formation of the Genbonichi system that made possible the so-called discovery of the self. So what's happening in Japan at this time is that Japan, prior to the major restoration, Japanese literature is in Chinese, both in terms of its content and its script. It's only after the 1868, the Meiji period, that they actually start formulating Japanese discourse, in terms of having a written language that would correspond to the spoken language, but also coming up with more Japanese language, Japanese stories, Japanese literature. Prior to that, literature and studying Japanese literature meant studying classic Chinese literature. So we're in a very, very radical period. And it's at this time, of course, that Japan hyper-modernizes, going from a feudal state, basically with closed borders for more than 2 centuries, and immediately recognizing, although in that time the rest of the world has really been modernizing very quickly, and they go basically into a hyper-modern state, which has some advantages, but also has some disadvantages in terms of the synchronicity or coherency of your experience of being Japanese at the time. So this is, of course, one of the first and most important inversion that Karatani makes in his rereading of modernity. Namely, that the discovery of the self was never a discovery at all. It was a fabrication from the very beginning. So instead of the confessional system being like, I'm going to speak about myself, what Karatani wants to argue is that this whole notion of the self that the Shosetsu movement is discussing is actually a complete Europeanization of Japanese experience, and that their idea of the person didn't come with the idea of the self that we had in Europe at the time. So the whole confessional system, most people would think, we'll find the system as a means of confession. Karatani would say, no, actually, it's the system that creates the self that's confessing. There's an inversion, there's a circle here, and it goes counterintuitively what most of us, I think, would think logically, and probably most of us have been taught in terms of self and its expression. So the I, or self, that's being confessed is actually only a narrative construct, and one that Karatani argues is one that's taken over through the reading of Russian literature and European literature at the end of the 19th century in Japan. Now, as I hope to show, it is also this fluidity that demonstrates both authors, that is Karatani and Abe, their connection to modernism, where the question of the self or subject plays such a dominant role. Now, to appreciate this role, we must first go back and show the problems with the temporality, or the experience of time, the temporality of the self in the Shosetsu movement. What I would like to draw your attention to is to the parallels that the problems and paradoxes that were being considered in Japan at that time were strongly influenced by a particular reading of the very same problems in European modernism. And this is precisely Karatani's point. We need to seriously reconsider whether or not the subject in Japanese literature was, in fact, a genuinely Japanese subject. And while Karatani's genealogical critique is undeniably the point of departure, I would like to suggest that this issue, or the question of the subject both in and of Japanese literature, is developed even further, and intentionally so, in Kobo Abe's metafictional reflections on the role and status of writing, what we mean by writing, who writes when we write, and the formulation of the philosophical subject. But first, some more background. Now, it is undeniably not an exaggeration to say that the importance and centrality of the Shosetsu movement in modern Japanese literature cannot be overestimated. Indeed, the end of the 19th century and early decades of the 20th century show major changes both in the literary style and content. And this has led many scholars to associate, if not even adequate, Japanese modernism in general with the Shosetsu, or confessional, or I-novel. Kume Masao, for example, in describing this phenomenon, famously and unequivocally stated that, quote, "In the final analysis, the basis of all art lies in the self." It follows then that the form that expresses the self directly and frankly, without pretense and disguise, that is to say, the I-novel, should become the main path, the basis, and the essence of the art of prose, end quote. So in general, the theoretical basis of the Shosetsu can be described as an autobiographical, confessional style through which the author accurately and genuinely, honestly, lays bare the factual elements of his or her personal life under the thinnest of stylistic veils. It is, in essence, the declaration and revelation of the true self of the author. Of course, the existence of this, quote, true self is what becomes so central for the authors that I'm concerned with. Karatani, for example, states, "I want to stress that it is the Genban Ichi itself that sustains this very illusion, namely that there is an inner self existing in and of itself." So it's the style that creates this and that maintains the illusion, which for Karatani is just that. There's no substance to this, especially in, quote, modern, quote, Japanese, quote, literature. But the importance of this genre and its consequences are not limited solely to literary endeavors. As Takeuchi Ruchi concluded, quote, "The problem of the I-novel is never limited to the question of literature. Instead, it is related to the nature of the modernity of our country as a whole, 20th century," end quote. However, without denying its relevance, there are clearly several presuppositions at play in such declarations. Most notably, the question of the self that is being revealed and expressed. Again, Karatani and Abe will both question this basis and this bias. And Abe's The Boxman, the novel I'm most interested in particular can, and I would argue should, be read as an exploration of the remnants of modernity that still must yet be overcome. Furthermore, if it is the case, as Karatani Kojin has argued, that the notions of modern, Japanese, and literature are conceptual borrowings, or perhaps more accurately, impositions or infections brought to Japan from Europe during the Meiji period, then it is unarguably the case that in order to understand the nature and consequences of the Shosetsu movement, we must turn our attention westward and consider the European modernist movement and identify the elements that Japanese modernists were responding to and, arguably, emulating in their theoretical disposition. Now, literary historians generally trace the origins of the autobiographical genre in Japan to the works of the Japanese naturalist writers, focusing primarily on Tayama Katai's Futon from 1907. Donald Keene, who in his History of Modern Japanese Literature describes the most salient features of this movement with the following long description. But Donald Keene is unfortunately just died last year. He's the foremost Western scholar in Japanese literature. So if you're interested in studying more Japanese literature, looking at Donald Keene as a point of departure would be highly recommended reading. And he says, quote, "As many critics have pointed out, Japanese naturalism developed along quite different lines from any European example. European naturalism arose largely as a reaction to the excessive emphasis on the individual in Romantic literature. But in Japan, the most telling feature of naturalist writing was the search for the individual. This search was intensified after the brief flowering of a specifically Romantic literature had passed and achieved its full expression in the I novel, which were attempts in the form of novels to establish the individuality of the authors. So the European naturalism of Zola or Maupassant came to be interpreted not as a method of examining human beings with scientific detachment, as it was in Europe, but as absolutely faithful reproductions of real events, without admixture of fiction or even of imagination." End quote from Donald Keene. Thus, according to the standard view, the mature form of Japanese naturalism, which flourished from 1906 until the early 1920s, emphasized the quest for the individual self through the, quote, "faithful, objective reproduction of the author's personal life in his or her novels," end quote. Naturally, this depiction presupposes, of course, the coherency of the subject or the self in the process. Nevertheless, in this version of literary history, Tayama Katai is considered a naturalist and the founder of the I novel, and Shiga Naoya is the writer who pushed this form to its most elegant and ideal formulation. But both of these claims seem to have entered the canon without any real consideration for the accuracy of the basic tenets of their position. The self being expressed has been accepted with the same lack of critique. And it's just this self that, again, Karatani and Abe want to call into question. Fortunately, however, such brilliant scholars as Suzuki Tomi and Lipit Seiji have clearly demonstrated that the story behind the odd novel is actually much more complex and consequently not necessarily as clear-cut as may first seem. It seems that despite the established position of the I novel in literary historiography and the wide, if not universal, circulation of the term, the definitive definition of the I novel remains extremely elusive and difficult to grasp. The vocabulary or terminology of the shosetsu is actually a good place to start. As Karatani shows, it becomes prominent in the early mid-20s, and thus clearly at the end of the period itself, and originally referred to the autobiographical style that I quoted Donald Keene describing. The problems become more interesting when one tries to define the I novel thematically or stylistically. Here it becomes clear that it is impossible to reach a comprehensive definition of the I novel by examining only those texts designated as I novels. Suzuki Tomi has come up with an elegant way, following Karatani, of describing the situation by distinguishing the shosetsu novels from what she calls, quote, the I novel discourse. Thus, for Suzuki and Karatani, quote, the term watakushi shosetsu circulated as a powerful and uncanny signifier without a fixed, identifiable signified, generating a critical discourse that informed not only the nature of literature, but also views of Japanese selfhood, Japanese society, and Japanese tradition. My suggestion today is that this same lack of a, quote, fixed, identifiable signifier, end quote, should also be incorporated into our understanding of the subject in, and therefore of, modern Japanese literature. From the 1920s, the I novel meta-narrative clearly defined the modern Japanese novel as a form that directly transcribed the author's lived experience and which emphasized the confessional and autobiographical. But what actually was the nature of this I, or this self, that was so intent on expressing itself? Legacies, in his excellent monograph called Topographies of Japanese Modernism, turns to the foremost figure in the history of Japanese literary theory, Kobayashi Hideo, to answer this question. And Kobayashi's position will in turn prove vitally important for all 20th century literary theory in Japan, and particularly for Kobo Abe and Karatani Kojin. Now, the key attribute of modern Japanese culture for Kobayashi is a profound feeling of homelessness. And this is one of the themes that actually arguably makes Murakami's work so popular in Japan. Now, Murakami, of course, is a worldwide author in terms of his success and influence. And that's a strange phenomenon, something that the content being so specifically Japanese would resonate outside of Japan. Actually, a good friend of mine once confessed to me that he said that it was very bizarre to find the closest voice to his own experience from a writer from Japan, a country that he had never been to. But the idea is going to be that this experience of Japanese culture from the 1920s onwards, basically because of the hyper-modernization and the speed with which they modernized in the Meiji period, is going to be a sense of homelessness, a certain sense of loss and displacedness of, well, I'm Japanese, and what does that mean to be Japanese? So this feeling of homelessness and importantly loss, as Kobayashi famously wrote, quote, "Where there is no memory, there is no home." If a person does not possess powerful memories created from an accumulation of hard and fast images that a hard and fast environment provides, he will not know the sense of well-being which brims over in the word kokyo, which turns out is the title of a book by Soseki. Now, no matter where I search within myself for such a feeling, says Kobayashi, I do not find it. Looking back, I see that from an early age, my feelings were distorted by an endless series of changes, all occurring too fast. There was never sufficient time to nurture the sources of a powerful and enduring memory, attached to the concrete in particular. I had memories, but they possessed no actuality and no substance, end quote. As Lippitt clarifies, this sense of loss is most acute and most evident in the constantly changing urban expanses of Tokyo. But its meaning also reaches deeper and extends all the way to the temporality of the past. It is not just the things around Kobayashi that disrupt his sense of personal continuity. It is the absence of a clear link to a definitive past. It is the ambiguity between native and foreign that Kobayashi sees as at the heart of Japanese modernity. And this is certainly a point of affinity shared with both Karatani and Abe. Lippitt argues that, quote, the internalization of foreign culture has advanced to the point that self and other can no longer be distinguished, end quote. Most importantly, Kobayashi sees this malignancy as being the foundation for contemporary literature. He writes, quote, "It goes without saying that our nation's modern literature, for which in everything the word modern and the word Western have the same meaning, cannot have survived without the influence of the West. But what is important is that we have become so used to the reception of Western influence that we can no longer identify it as a Western influence," end quote. That is, if the other can no longer be properly identified as being other, the same must also hold true for the self. Now, what I particularly find relevant is the fact that Kobayashi's depiction of the experience of urban spaces in the 30s is uncannily similar to Kobo Abe's depiction of the contemporary urban landscape depicted in the Boxman. Now, due to its structure and content, Kobo Abe's novel, The Boxman, is not a novel that readily lends itself to summarization. It's a very trippy book. But basically, there are a few key elements that I'd like to draw your attention to. While there are many brilliant strategies at play in this novel, the basic content concerns a man about whom all we know is that he was a former photographer that decides to become a boxman, which is literally what it sounds like. he finds a cardboard box. He meticulously cuts an aperture into it from which to view the world, and sets about doing just that, sitting in his box, invisibly gazing at the world as it happens before him. As he says, quote, "My case. This is the record of a boxman. I am beginning this account in a box. A cardboard box that reaches just to my hips when I put it on over my head. That is to say, at this point, at this juncture, the boxman is me. A boxman in his box is recording the chronicle of a boxman." End quote. Now, one of the key issues here is thus the possibility of the subject, which is our boxman, is to accurately and honestly depict his experiences, which for me immediately focuses the philosophical attention on the questions of metafiction, or fiction about fiction. And in so doing, centralizes the metafictional nature of the literary subject. Now, the major incident in the novel involves our boxman being hunted by a fake boxman, whom is eventually found and confronted. But this only leaves our original boxman perplexed about the meaning of the real and the fake. Now, while excessive detail is offered to the reader concerning the construction of the box, if you want to make one yourself, it's very clear how to do so. One very important detail is stated at the beginning, but begins to fade throughout the novel. And that is the fact that the boxman is writing the events witnessed along the interior walls of the box. As he says at one point, of course, only one of us really exists, the one who is in fact continuing to write these notes. Everything that has happened is merely the monologue of that someone. Even you must recognize that. At the rate things are going, this someone intends to go on writing forever and ever in order to cling desperately to the box. End quote. Now obviously, the link I'm trying to make here is between a notion of subjectivity or a fixation on the self and the self as a notion of a static, fixed notion, and the box that our boxman wants to construct and build and use to protect himself against the people that he experiences in the changing world of Tokyo. Like Kobayashi says, he's losing his link to the past, he's losing a link to himself. And what he's looking for is a means of stasis, a means of solidifying and slowing down the movement, protecting himself so he actually can form these memories, which of course, by writing them on the interiority of the cardboard box, it's the same way, it's the perfect metaphor for the way that we ascribe our own experiences into our own memory. You know? Now, I would like to suggest that this is Abe's critique and depiction of the eventual consequences of the presupposed modern self, which, as Karatani mentioned, was created through the passive and inaccurate adaptation of a perceived conception of European modernism that was absorbed wholeheartedly by the Shosetsu movement and Japanese modernism in general. Abe's novel therefore depicts the demise of the self in the alienating world of Japan's contemporary urban existence. But it does not simply leave us empty-handed. In fact, it offers a means of resistance, which, as previously mentioned, the boxman begins with, but tragically loses his connection with, namely, writing. Now, writing, as Kobo Abe makes explicit in his theoretical work, does not simply indulge in the nostalgia described by Kobayashi, the longing for a lost past, but instead pursues a different, more active path, what Abe calls, quote, sustained flight, and which is what I want to argue is structurally consistent with Karatani's event of inversion. Abe writes that concerning the future of education, quote, what is needed is the talent to make leaps. The ability to make leaps in thought involves leaping away from certain kinds and styles of thinking. This and this alone should be taught, end quote. Now, the leap in question for Abe is only achieved by engaging with the dissolution of the self, not the presupposition of its existence that is enacted through the process of writing. In writing, we challenge the notion of the self. The coherency of the self falls apart. If you write and think you only mean one thing, read the same thing you wrote the next day, and you'll see, oh, now I'm not sure what I wrote. If you've written a poem or a short story, its meaning will escape you as time changes. That's what we're talking about here in terms of the self not being as coherent and stable and static as we like to think it is all the time. The beauty of literature, and I think one of the unique challenges literature presents to us in terms of our experience with ourselves and philosophically as well, is that it disrupts the illusion of the consistency and coherency of the self. We can lie to ourselves in philosophy all we want. We can lie to ourselves in economics much easier. But in literature, it's much more difficult to lie to yourself about the notion of, oh, this is me staying and speaking in one voice the whole time, all the time. Much harder to do that in literature. It's one of its great advantages in terms of for education. Now, and just like the Boxman at the beginning of the novel, the construction of the self, instead of being presupposed, it becomes a task, becomes an event, becomes a challenge. Quote, writers are never writers from the beginning. One is a reader before becoming a writer. It's only after reaching a certain stage of maturity, as a reader does, can one jump to the level of the writer, end quote. Now, the problem with the Boxman is that instead of achieving this level, instead of sticking with his development as a reader of the textual world outside of his box, he falls prey to the scopic or visual desire and its fetishistic need for control, for seeing and naming the world as a whole. In contrast to this, Abe suggests in his essay called The Frontier Within that, quote, one first makes the leap to being a writer when one feels the need to read materials that are only rarely read. Of course, reading many books is no guarantee that one will become a writer. There are always people who cannot write no matter how many books they read. But reading gives rise to something within one, and writing provokes the desire to share this urgent, spontaneous feeling with others. Who is this other? In fact, this other is oneself. Here, an internal split first appears between the writer and the reader, who is in fact the same person, end quote. Now, Abe describes this as being analogous to, quote, a process of cellular division, where the writer emerges inside when one feels the need to give something new and original to oneself as an other. This, of course, represents a leap to another level. Unlike the Boxman, who struggles specifically with the distinction between the genuine and the copy, quote, real writers do not seek to establish readers outside of themselves. Real writers should understand that the other is simultaneously themselves. It is thus false to say that one writes for oneself or for the masses. One writes for neither. The self is divided between reader and writer. And the true process of literary creation consists of a dialogue between these two, end quote. It is here that I think we can most clearly see the genuine bond between Karatani's inversion, which, it must be remembered, began as a critique of a very specific form of writing, and then Abe's notion of writing, in that both represent a modality of existence, a means of avoiding the idolatry of the self that dominated Japanese modernism. In contrast to this nostalgic and delusional desire, we must follow Karatani's inversions and Abe's writing, which pursue, quote, the notion that we need to cultivate concerns of the state of a sustained flight. What does this mean? Whereas settling down somewhere is a basic condition, remaining in a state of sustained flight is a process. We carry within ourselves a prejudice that this process invariably involves settling down somewhere. My point here consists in shedding doubt on this prejudice, end quote. Now, in an attempt at a conclusion, what I hope to have made clear today is that the prejudice that Abe is alluding to, and which he deconstructs so masterfully in his work, is more than just a tendency for physical stagnation and ossification, or the desire to protect ourselves within philosophical and or cardboard constructs. It is equally, if not primarily, concerned with questioning the nature and modality of the subject, both in and of literature. Thank you for your attention.
I'd like to thank Professor Atkinson for this deep and insightful lecture. And now I will open up the floor for questions. Go ahead.
So like you said, it's complicated literature. And so what would you want us to understand when we walk out today?
What I'd like you to understand today, very good question. I'd like you to understand anything that you could grab onto. I'd like you to understand the most important thing, I think, would be the idea of the subject needs to be thought about in terms of being of and in literature. We have a topic of literature, but metafiction or fiction that's about the process of writing, which is a major issue in modern and postmodern thinking, really is about the question of what it means to write and who this self is that thinks it's writing. So if I would say that one idea I'd like you to walk away with, that'd be the self as an issue, the self as a complex task, that instead of just assuming this is me and I'm good, but the idea that the self is something that is the result of an ongoing process. And if society and thought in general in a certain sense will encourage us to grab a hold and like the Boxman, build a little construct and sit safely in it and just keep the rest of the world outside. But for Karatani and Abe, we need to stay in contact with the world, in contact with the constant changing nature of ourselves that is exemplified by modern literature like this. So the Boxman is a very trippy book to read. It's also very funny. The first time through can be a little bit complicated. But I have a theory in terms of the first time through good literature. I don't believe in first readings. I don't believe they exist. I think that a first reading is created retroactively by a second reading. So after you read it twice, you will have read it once. But after reading it once, you actually haven't read it once yet. And the second reading can be a literal, physical reading the book twice, or it can just be engaging with someone else who's read it. But yeah, so you're taking the subject as a task and taking advantage of modern and postmodern literature as an exploration of the task of the self, I think would be the most important thing I'd like you to walk away with, or at least the interest and the possibility thereof. Good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, when you stated one writes for neither self nor others, do you mind going more into depth about that? I was just a little confused.
It's a little trippy, I understand. Yeah. So, Abe's got the thing about Abe was an extremely influential novelist. Didn't win the Nobel Prize, but was considered for it on multiple occasions, and also extremely influential director and dramaturg here in Japan. And his plays are still performed very, very often. He also has a series of theoretical work called The Frontier Within, where he actually talks about literature and talks about the nature of literature from a theoretical perspective. When he talks about not writing for the self or the other, he wants to stress that these are abstract concepts which we use to basically to understand our experience. So I think I'm talking now, and I think you're listening now. For Abe, and I think for Karatani as well, both the self and the other are much more fluid and less stable experiences or modalities than we are comfortable talking about and thinking about. And so when we say, I don't write for the self, it's because my self actually isn't something that actually ever really is there. And the other should be treated the same way. And that if I objectify you by seeing you as young, female, of a certain ethnicity or whatever, these are categories that I'm grabbing onto as a means of controlling and understanding you. And while they all might be true in a certain sense, they're also an illusion of control. And then in terms of writing should be about overcoming the illusion of a sense of security of self and of other. Like I said, if you ever actually done any creative writing yourself, whether it's poetry or a short story, if you write something like that and come back to it a week later, it's really disturbing when you see, oh my God, I thought I meant this, or I thought I loved you, it turns out that I hate you, these things happen, and it's that plurality of meaning that we see in terms of pointing out the illusion of self as a static concept, So when I speak now, like, I feel like I'm saying what I say what I mean and mean what I say. That language is a tool that I use. But in the literary sense of the notion of literature in and of the self, and subject in and of literature, I'm at the mercy of language. And so in a certain sense, my identity is the result of it, as opposed to me being in charge of it. Go ahead.
So before, I guess, Meiji Japan and European modernism and that influence, I guess, what was the notion of self and other in, I guess, pre-modern Japanese literature, or even?
That's a very good question, and a very, very debated question in terms of Japanese philosophy. Obviously, they had a sense of self, but it was generally much closer tied to tradition, to religion, to the emperor, for example. And traditionally, and particularly in regards to Japanese literature was actually Chinese literature. So as a language, Japanese happens arguably around the 9th century. But they actually don't start forming their own alphabet until, in a very, very concrete manner, until the Meiji period, when they actually start writing, having an alphabet for the vernacular. There's a really fun story, that Karatani talks about, where so the Japanese after the Meiji period, 1880s kind of thing, they're like, oh my God, everybody's modernizing so quickly, we need to modernize. And so they started importing experts in from everywhere just to say, like, okay, tell us what this is and tell us what this is. And so they had a bunch of Italian painters imported from Italy saying, okay, teach us about painting. The Japanese have been painting for centuries. They're like, no, we don't know anything about painting, teach us painting. And there's this great story about, this Italian master who comes and he wants to teach the Japanese landscape painting. And the Japanese have beautiful portrayals of nature, but they didn't have something like landscape in terms of this static self looking out over an external world. The self was always part of that world in classical Japanese view. And the story goes that the Italian master has a group of Japanese students, and he says, okay, he takes them out to the fields, and he says, okay, now we're nature, these are the fields, go out and paint a landscape. And at the end of the day, they come back and they haven't painted anything, and they're all very, very sad and very, very ashamed. And he's like, what have you been doing all day? What happened? They're like, we're sorry, master, we couldn't find a landscape. And for me, that just personifies the whole story. They're looking at the goddamn landscape right in front of them, but they can't see it as such, because they're still more closely related to it. And as a result of European modernism, we have this glorification of the self and the individual. We see ourselves standing apart from it. This is me looking at the horizon, the landscape. And they were still connected to it, to such an extent that standing in a field in the countryside, they're like, where's the landscape? Where's the landscape? And they actually can't even see it in front of them. So I think that's the best way to look at it in terms of saying that there's a little more, they knew that they were individuals in a certain sense, but there's a little more cohesiveness to it that we radicalized in Europe or in the Western modification of this. Yeah.
So you mentioned that there's no real Japanese literature until after the Meiji era, but where would a lot of Japanese classical poetry or the tale of Genji fit into that?
That is a great question, because I think if you're ever in a pub quiz, the proper answer to what was the first novel is the tale of Genji. These are more going to be considered in terms of classical tales in a certain sense. So the tale of Genji is brought together as in a novelistic form, and I certainly read it like it's a novel. And as I said, Karatani is an infamous figure in Japan. So I've given more than a few papers on Karatani and have had Japanese member of my audience being like, we hate Karatani, just because he says some very challenging things. There's something. So the Japanese people are writing something like literature, but what we actually mean by the term literature is generally, especially in the modern sense, has a different discursive strategy. So like Foucault, for example, says literature doesn't actually exist until the 17th century. And you're like, well, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Persians have people writing literature for a long time. Well, they're telling stories, but literature for us in the modern age requires a certain sense of reflexivity about the nature and medium, instead of just classically the self is speaking and then the speaking self writes it down. You have literature. In Karatani's reading, especially in the origin of modern Japanese literature, there's no actual origin in the sense that it comes from a Japanese experience. Basically, the idea of modern means Western. and the idea of self and literature. These are all Western concepts in a certain sense, that are adapted, at warp speed by the Japanese during the Meiji period. And so we know of course that there are things being written. So the Japanese have beautiful poetry and theater, and no theater from the 14th century onwards. But so no one's denying the existence of things like that. But that what we mean by literature today, in a modern sense, with a certain more reflexivity to the language involved, that wasn't going on. Argues Karatani. So argues Karatani. And so he actually has beautiful essays on much earlier work. But there we have things that the notion of the self, the notion of landscape. So each of the chapters in the book Origin of Modern Japanese Literature cover a major trope or a theme that is inherited or imposed on itself by Japan from Europe. So landscape, interiority, the child, illness. These are all various themes that hadn't been themed. People got sick, obviously, in Japan before that. But using illness as a certain theme or trope wasn't something that they actually had looked at in a theoretic level for literature. So people were writing things, but the notion of the self who was doing that writing, the corresponding paradoxes and challenges about the nature of language and self that were involved there, that hadn't happened yet. And for Karatani, that happens like from night to day, real quickly, and actually too quickly. So this happens over a period of like 200 years in Europe. So Dante, writing in Italian, actually breaks away from Latin, and he actually goes into the vernacular. So it gets like 14th century. So we've got like 300 years to get used to people writing the way they speak, as opposed to just writing in high languages, like we do in the classic sense. In Japan, this happens like in a generation. Like, there was no alphabet for Japanese, and then 20 years later, suddenly there's a Japanese self who's confessing himself and explaining everything. So in the Shosetsu novels, the argument is basically in the romantic version, or in the modern version, there's a certain romanticism still at work here in terms of like Flaubert, where the self is suffering itself in a certain sense. And the Japanese modern self is just declaring itself, so they're just saying everything they're doing. So now I'm drinking too much, now I'm prostituting myself. Like all the things you shouldn't talk about in Japanese society, they're still like confessing in books and just, and they're mostly for other authors, but they're just speaking in the first person in a way that had never been done before. So it's a very striking contrast, and if you look at it in terms of the influence of the West, and really you can trace this. So the many Japanese scholars that I admire and respect, immensely, who disagree with Karatani, I understand their point, and their dissatisfaction with some of his readings. But I think you can trace it very, very clearly. He's got a very good argument in terms of this wasn't happening prior to 1868. And then 1868, January 1st at noon, suddenly it was. And this has consequences for our sense of history. And this is why Kobayashi, in terms of identifying the sense of loss or homelessness that defines Japanese identity, says this happens because we modernize too fast. Like modernity involves a sense of alienation, even in the West. But we do it over a period of 200 years. Imagine if you do it over a period of like 40 years or 30 years. The sense of loss is going to be exponentially more intense. This is what a lot of people talk about in terms of trying to explain the popularity, as I mentioned before, of Murakami. That Murakami is loads of fun to read, but it's also pretty dark. In terms of there's a sense of I have no idea where I'm going or who I am in this novel, and these are always Japanese characters. They're always living in Japan, and as I imagine most of you guys know better than me, there's a very, very large experience of people your age, that are alienating themselves from society in Japan, that are just closing themselves off in their rooms, and just saying, I'm not going to be involved in society anymore, just because this is not, a childish display of of being spoiled or anything. This is a sense of I don't see where I fit, and therefore this experience is overwhelming for me. That's really what Karatani and Abe are talking about, and they're doing it much, much earlier than Murakami. Murakami does it in a beautiful and entertaining and much more complex manner than I think most people realize. Most people read Murakami like it's just for fun. Murakami is one of those things that I think students and professors can both enjoy at the same time. Like you can read Murakami on the beach and not think twice about it, be like that was fun, that was cool, yay. But he also is really incredibly well versed in his theory and his history. He knows all the random dates in Murakami are not random at all. If you know Japanese history, you know everything is really, really, really intended. And it's meant to be passed over like it doesn't mean anything. He knows you're gonna read right past this, but he still puts it in there. So yeah, you can read it at the beach, you can read it in the library. I think that's one of the reasons why Murakami is such an interesting cultural phenomenon right now. Really depicts the experience not only of the self in terms of Japanese identity, but also in terms of Japanese modern literature as well.
You talked about the disconstruction of oneself
Uh-huh.
in order to understand the lack of consistency. But isn't this lack of consistency in the writing allows us to have ambiguity and what makes art, right? And
Exactly.
So by disconstructing oneself, one would understand this lack of consistency, and so it is a part of the ambiguity of art. And so writing would become just an activity rather than art, right? So
Yes, I think there's always an activity or a praxis involved in art as well. The thing, and this is where I will definitely piss people off, in terms of discussing arts and theory. I would certainly, of course, I like literature. I have a certain prejudice towards literature because it uses language, I know that the external world that I see is not my construct. I mean, like I construct my perception of it. I know that your shirt is not naturally purple. I see it as purple. But I'm a little more aware of that. I think there's a more natural tendency to think that I'm in charge of language, and the issue is really reminding ourselves, no, you're not. Language is so much further ahead of you, and you're so much more dependent upon it. But yeah, so in terms of making writing an activity of a self that has yet to happen, of art in a real profound sense, of creativity and exploration, and not creativity as a creative declaration of what I happen to think, but creativity in terms of the active creation of the self that is actually writing. So I'm writing right now, but I, in the first person, have yet to be written until I have written. So there's a circularity there that is clearly paradoxical until you put it into practice. But yeah, definitely the case for both, I think, for Abe and for Karatani, that writing is a very, very artistic act where the self is the project, as opposed to the self expressing itself somewhere else on the canvas.
I'll be the last one then to comment on what you were saying. So, going back to the first question posed by one of our students, the blurring of the lines between the experience of the self, as lived experience, as a subject or object of literature, and in terms of, let's say, we've discussed something along the lines here in our classes about the utopian nature of the self, right? As it's something something that has not happened yet, as you pointed out, it's constantly happening, right? And those lines can be blurred as to what is the self in terms of various, let's say, variables that you mentioned earlier. So, does Karatani, or perhaps yourself, do you have anything to say about this? Would you agree that it's the self, in the last instance, is a utopian dream or fantasy or something like that?
Yeah, I think for both for Karatani and for Abe, the notion of the self is clearly a discursive construct. In a sense, that we are the self we think that we talk about ourselves as. And Karatani does it a little more historical, synopsis and review of certain key concepts, like I mentioned, in terms of landscape and interiority. But in the Boxman, again, complicated novel, but really loads of fun. I mean, confusing as hell, but it's fun being confused when you know that the product is actually really meaningful. It's fun being confused and pursuing the meaning. The students in my book club hated me for a month, and afterwards they're like, okay, that actually was really kind of cool. But yeah, so the Boxman himself, I think, is actually like a microcosm view of that whole view. You see that by creating this cardboard box on himself, this is the assertion of this utopian notion of the self. And the writing on the inside of the walls is the inscription of memory that he eventually gets caught up in watching more than recording, you know, and keeping his hands on it. So the notion of the self that he starts with, he forgets that it's a construct. He forgets that he builds the box, you know, exactly along the lines that you're suggesting of the utopian notion of the self. Yeah.
Thank you. So if there are no further questions or comments, last chance. In this case, I would like to thank you all for coming here today. We had a really, really nice discussion, productive discussion, and we'll take it upon in our class later on, so we'll inform Professor Atkinson of the results of this continued discussion. And I would like us all to thank Professor Atkinson with a nice round of applause.
Thank you guys for coming. Read some